François Longuet and the Reading Mission. Some of you will have seen me recently talking about my most recent subject, my book on Henry I and the abbey he founded in Reading. My subject today also played an important part in the town's religious history, but very few people know about him, even though every year thousands of people stand over his grave as they receive communion at St. James's Church in Reading Town Centre. So many thanks for inviting me to talk about François Longuet, who founded what was then known as the Reading Mission. From small beginnings, it would grow into one of the largest and most vibrant Catholic communities in the south of England. I'd like to start by showing you some paintings of Reading in the early 19th century, when François Longuet first arrived in the town. As you can see, it was still partly rural, but with manufacturing industries beginning to develop. The bridge in the second picture crosses the Kennet-Avon Canal, begun in 1724 and completed in 1810. It was very much a market town, with the funnel-shaped marketplace, that's bottom left, established by the monks of the abbey from the 12th century as the centre of trade. The fourth picture shows St. Mary's, the Anglican minster church, with a south aisle said to have been built with stones from the demolished abbey. But by the late 18th century, Reading was very much a Protestant town. An annual bonfire was still held to celebrate the rout of James II's Catholic Irish troops, killed during the glorious, or so-called bloodless revolution, when the townspeople fired on them from the houses in the marketplace. There was a great deal of anti-Catholic feeling, and yet Catholics did still live there, keeping their heads down. But extraordinarily, one of the most important businesses in Reading, the Reading Mercury newspaper, was owned and edited by a Catholic. What is even more extraordinary is that this person was a woman, Anna Maria Smart. She was the wife of the poet and journalist Christopher, or Kit, Smart, these days best remembered for his poem about his cat Geoffrey. His growing mental instability and religious mania, which had led him to describe his previously beloved wife as a Moabite woman, had led his own family to suggest that Anna Maria leave him and stay with their relatives in Ireland before returning to take over the family publishing business in Reading. As a single parent running a busy newspaper, she sent her two daughters, Marianne and Elizabeth, to be educated at an Ursuline convent in Boulogne in France. By the 1890s, both of them were middle-aged, and Marianne had a growing family. It was one of Marianne's daughters, writing many decades later in the 1840s, who gave us a first-hand account of life for local Catholics, and part of the story I am going to tell you. It is known as the Cowslade manuscript, and for many years was kept in the Portsmouth Diocesan Archives. However, in the Second World War, a high-explosive bomb dropped on the Archbishop's house, killing 6 domestic staff and rupturing a water tank in the roof, with hundreds of gallons of water destroying most of the archives. Very fortunately, some of the most important of these had been copied by a young priest, Father Henry King, later to become Archbishop. And these copies, including Eleanor Cowslade's account, were safely in Winchester. Eleanor wrote about how the town swarmed with dissenters, but described how part of a house in Minster Street was let out as a secret mass room, to which the small Catholic community came occasionally to hear mass, said by a Franciscan, Father, or as she calls him, Mr. Bainham. So, where did the priest come from? Ironically, though Reading itself was Protestant, most of the big houses around Reading and in much of the Thames Valley were staunchly Catholic and had been so since the Reformation. This Father Bainham was the chaplain to the Perkins family at Ufton Court, between Reading and Newbury. Another Elizabethan mansion to the north was Mapledurham House, built at the time of the Spanish Armada, complete with priest's holes, and home to the Blunt family. Like Ufton Court, it had a secret chapel, and a towel hung from an upstairs window signalled that a priest was available to say Mass. White Knights Park, now the university campus, was home to the Englefields, until what Eleanor calls the offensive prejudices of the neighbouring gentry led them to leave. Finally, Woodley Lodge was the residence of James Webble, who would later found St. James's Church. All these houses had chapels, originally secret but later legal, following the 1791 Catholic Relief Act. This is the Strawberry Hill Gothic Chapel of Mapledurham House. Eleanor Cowslade tells us that the room in Minster Street was used until the landlord, when his wife was in labour, believed that the Catholic service would bring bad luck and told them to leave. Though the Mass continued on that occasion, Elizabeth Smart decided to look elsewhere. The decriminalisation of Catholic worship allowed Elizabeth and Marianne to buy, or possibly lease, a tenement called Finch's Buildings, also known as Lady Vatchel's house, to use as a legal Mass centre. The chapel was upstairs, and Sir Henry Englefield allowed the furnishings from the Englefield Chapel at White Knights to be used to make it ready. It could hold 170 people, but was to prove providential for another purpose. This unexciting-looking front page of the Reading Mercury from late July 1789 contains a report on the fall of the Bastille, and thus the start of the French Revolution, which was to have a galvanizing effect on the Catholic community in Reading. Initially, the overthrow of the Ancien Régime was welcomed in Britain, but disturbing developments were to change that opinion. The revolutionary government, rightly seeing the French Church as one of the bastions of the Ancien Régime, began stripping it of its powers and property. As in England during the dissolution, monasteries and convents were closed, and monks and nuns turned out into the street, while their convents were ransacked. In October 1789, the Mercury published a letter from an Ursuline nun, a friend of Marianne and Elizabeth, describing the desolation she and her sisters felt at being expelled from the only home she had ever known. In late 1790, the civil constitution of the clergy, which severely limited the powers of the papacy in France, required all parish priests, who were now to become civil servants, to swear an oath of allegiance to the nation in public, after High Mass, outside their church. About half the clergy refused to sign, and by the following year they were declared suspect and liable to expulsion from their parishes. In 1792, these priests were given 2 weeks to leave the country or face deportation to the fever-ridden French colony of Guyana. A trickle, then a flood of French priests began to arrive in Britain and in other countries surrounding France. Aidan Bellinger, the authority on the French exiled clergy, states that by December 1792, there were over 6,000 exiled French priests in Britain. Even more arrived following the execution of Louis XVI in January 1793. This Cruikshank cartoon shows a group of exiles reading the late decree that all who return shall be put to death. Note that they are not in clerical dress. One of them even has a pigtail. From the Cowslade manuscript, we learn that Marianne and Elizabeth hearing that a small group of priests were waiting in Dover, invited them to come and live in Finch's Buildings. A larger group then came to live in the King's Arms Inn at the top of Castle Hill. The cedar of Lebanon that you see was almost certainly planted in gratitude by the priests. Eleanor writes of how the first group arrived secretly at night in the early 1793, looking like a party of smugglers, and were brought to Finch's Buildings. They were mostly elderly, but one of them, called Guy Millard de la Blardière, was 33 and spoke some English. His portrait, painted many years later, still hangs in the presbytery of St. James's Church. He later went to work as chaplain for James Webble at Woodley Lodge. In 1802, the mission registers tell us that a new young priest arrived at Finch's Buildings. His name was François Longuet, and he had been appointed as head of the community, probably because he spoke good English and was strong and healthy. He officiated at a baptism in October 1802. By this time, most of the French priests in Reading had left the King's Arms and returned to France, after Napoleon's concordat with the Pope. We are extraordinarily lucky to have this image of François Longuet. It's a pencil copy of an oil portrait, probably painted before he left France as a keepsake for his family. He looks more like a young revolutionary than a cleric. François was the youngest of 10 children, of a prosperous farmer in Normandy. His elder brother was a priest who was murdered, along with 200 other priests, friars, and other religious prisoners being held in the Carme prison, previously a Carmelite monastery, by a revolutionary mob in Paris during the Terror of 1792. They are known as the Martyrs of the Carmelite Massacre and were beatified by Pius XI in 1926. When the revolution broke out, François was 18 and a student at the seminary in Caen. At some point, possibly after the king's execution, he crossed to England. He was not ordained, but had received the tonsure. We know that he originally lodged in Portsmouth, but unfortunately, for the next 10 years, we have no record of him. Clearly, he was ordained at some point, but we don't know where or by whom. Although Longuet kept the mission registers and presided at the sacraments, he quickly seems to have fallen out with the other priests, who were elderly, and disapproved of some of his practices. However, he had a good friend in another French priest, 4 years older than him, called Charles Lefebvre, who was employed as the family archivist at Mapledurham. Most of what we know of François Longuet comes from a series of documents held in the Westminster Diocesan Archives of Our Lady of Victory's Church in Kensington. We learned about these through the Heritage Group at St. James's about 10 years ago, and John, my husband, and I made a series of highly enjoyable visits to the archives, made even more pleasant by lunch at a nearby pub. As the letters were rather difficult to read, we photographed each of the documents and later transferred them to my computer, where I was able to enlarge, transcribe, and when necessary translate them, as some were written in French. The file for François Longuet contains a series of letters between him and Bishop William Poynter, who became Vicar Apostolic for the London district in 1812. Before that, he had been coadjutant to Bishop John Douglas and president of St. Edmund's College at Ware in Hertfordshire. Previously, he had been Director of Studies at the English College in Douai, until it was closed by the revolutionary government. Initially, the letters are all from Poynter to Longuet, though we can deduce from them the content of Longuet's own letters. Bishop Douglas seems to have given Poynter the job of handling the mission in Reading. The series of letters begins in January 1809 with one in which Poynter commends Longuet for using the English version of the Roman breviary rather than the French one used by the older émigrés. Poynter has obviously recently visited Reading, as he comments on the good disposition of your little children and says that I was much pleased with the manner in which they answered me in the catechism. However, it is clear that Longuet has been asking him about the possibility of founding a new chapel. For whatever reason, the relationship between Longuet and the older priests seems to have deteriorated to the point at which he was asked to live elsewhere, though he continued to preside at weddings and funerals at the house. From the next letter, it's clear that Longuet has been working on ways to raise funds for his new house and chapel. Some of the money would have come from his teaching activities. We know that he taught French and Latin to local families. Although the bishop urges caution, suggesting a few years' wait, by the following January it is clear that Longuet has found freehold premises which he is proposing to buy. And on the 25th of the same month, Poynter agrees that Longuet can go ahead with the purchase, though he is insistent that the deeds should be made out in his, the bishop's, name. He asks for his best wishes to be passed to Charles Lefebvre at Maple Durham, and to a nun, Sister Lawrence, about whom we know nothing. Other letters mention another nun known as Madame or Mrs. Aston, who may have become Longuet's housekeeper. Unfortunately, the purchase must have fallen through. By August 1810, Poynter is writing, I pray that God may give you patience under all the disappointments. However, an envelope filed next to this letter has a sketch of a 3-storied property and what may be the proposed chapel. If so, it is our only picture of it. The next surviving letter is dated 1st of January 1811 and confirms that Longuet can go ahead with the purchase of the house in the name of Dr. Poynter. It's notable that he asks to be described as Dr. Poynter of Old Hall Green, not Bishop or Vicar Apostolic. No doubt he was wary of anti-Catholic prejudice. Unfortunately, not all the local English clergy approved of what Poynter describes as Longuet's pious designs. In a different folder in the archives, we found a rambling but vitriolic letter from Thomas Webster, the priest at Woolhampton. He reports on the increasingly bad feelings between the Finch's Buildings community and Longuet, who apparently was not even greeting the other priests when they met in a sick parishioner's room. Webster denies the rumour that he'd been told by Longuet to mind his congregation and Longuet would mind his own at Reading, calling it quite false. One of the causes of contention, which we today might applaud, is that Longuet has been requiring women and girls to repeat together aloud the answers in the serving at Mass. Webster calls this absurd, and reports that on one occasion a girl called Nancy, reproved by a respectable person for answering so loud as to be troublesome to others in the chapel, was instead encouraged by Longuet. Nancy, go on. It would appear that Longuet has been celebrating Christmas midnight Mass, despite Bishop Douglas's prohibition. He took it upon himself to say it at midnight again. One can almost hear the harumph in Webster's voice. Poynter does his best to make peace, and in February writes hoping that Longuet and the venerable French priests will all endeavour to accommodate each other and make one another as comfortable as possible. This is in the same letter which celebrates the completion of the purchase of the premises for a house and chapel, with the assistance of a Mr. Galini, who has made a sizable contribution to its costs. Francis Galini was the wealthy son of the impresario Giovanni Galini, owner of the King's Theatre in the Haymarket and ballet teacher to George III. Francis Galini lived in Yattenden, and his son was one of Poynter's pupils at Ware. and sometimes came to Reading with the bishop as his acolyte. Poynter asks Longuet to make sure the walls of the chapel are perfectly dry before using it, and promises to come to Reading after Easter once everything is prepared. In the next letter, he gives instructions for having the new chapel licensed at the Quarter Sessions under the terms of the 1791 Catholic Relief Act, but urges Longuet to avoid giving any offence to the Protestants by making too much éclat. The new chapel was now named the Chapel of the Resurrection, no doubt in reference to the rebirth of Catholicism after centuries of persecution. It was sited on what was then known as Vaston Lane, near to the present site of Reading Museum, and not far from the Forbury in the old Abbey Quarter. It looked as if all was well, with the chapel established and finance secured. But in April, Bishop Poynter must have been horrified to receive a fat package from Marianne, seen here in what was probably a wedding portrait from 1783, and Elizabeth, now married to an aristocratic French émigré, the Chevalier Jean-Baptiste Lenoir de la Brosse. It contained a copy of a letter from Longuet to them, and another from them to the bishop, complaining about Longuet's behaviour. The dispute, which was clearly acrimonious, was about the chapel furnishings, originally from the Englefield Chapel at White Nice House, which had been brought to Finch's Buildings. Longuet was now insisting that they be transferred to his new chapel, and there had obviously been an increasingly angry correspondence over the issue, with the sisters siding with the French priests. Longuet's letter to the sisters is the first we have in the series written by him, and he's clearly very angry that his request for the furnishings has been denied, though they have been used by every French priest these 8 years, and for no other reason than that the chapel is to be removed to a more convenient place and more adapted for the purpose. He also refers to the shameful way in which I was thrown out of my room at Finch's Buildings, with his supporters saying how ill you have been treated, and he hints darkly, I still have the letters of your mother, stating that he planned to publish them. Anna Maria had died in 1809. Unsurprisingly, these letters have not been kept. According to Longuet, he was being supported not only by his Catholic flock, except for those influenced by his enemies, but also by the local Protestants, who were encouraging him in his endeavours. Shockingly, he suggests that as a result of their persecution of him, great misfortune has come to Elizabeth and Marianne. This must refer to the suicide of Marianne's husband, Thomas Cowslade, who, in December 1806, shot himself with a pistol in Andover marketplace, leaving her with 9 or possibly 10 children, aged between 23 and 7. After insisting that he has the support of both bishops, Douglas and Poynter, plus God's blessing, Longuet urges the women to think again and see everything in a more proper light for the eternal welfare of your souls. Eleanor's covering letter tells Poynter that, disgracefully, Longuet handed his note to Marianne as she was leaving Mass. She reminds the bishop of how the sisters had brought the French priests to Reading and set them up in Finch's Buildings, and had paid for it themselves, with the aid of a benefice from Sir Henry Englefield and support from their mother, Mrs. Smart, till the period of a heavy misfortune which befell my sister about 4 years ago, and which you will find Mr. Longuet, forgetting his character as well as all regard to humanity and decency, is not ashamed to reproach her with. The sisters' version of why Longuet had been asked to leave Finch's Buildings was that it was on account of repeated complaints about him for a conduct which gave scandal and much uneasiness to the clergyman residing with him. We don't know to what this refers, perhaps just to allowing girls to serve at Mass, but the fact that Poynter and Douglas continued to support him would suggest that it can't have been very terrible. The letter ends with the hope that the old chapel will be allowed to remain, despite Longuet's desire to abolish it. How Bishop Poynter must have sighed as he read the two letters. It would appear that he asked Thomas Webster, perhaps not the most impartial referee, to try to mediate between Longuet and the sisters, and Webster told Poynter that he had tried to speak to Longuet, who had been away when he called, and had left a caveat forbidding Longuet from removing anything except his own property. However, after consulting Sir Henry, Poynter wrote in June with instructions that their furniture may be removed to the new chapel as soon as you think proper, adding that any contested items were to be removed even from the old chapel. Longuet must have felt vindicated, but the whole episode may strike us as unfortunate and unnecessary. The lawyer's bill for the purchase of the house and chapel is dated June 1811 and was finally settled in 1814. More positively, the succeeding letters, dating from late 1811 till 1814, give us a vivid picture of Longuet's activities in the mission. From a letter written by Longuet in June 1812, we know that he was acting as a prison chaplain in the first Reading jail, seen here in a painting by Havel. It's clear that Longuet is working alongside Protestant chaplains, whom he calls my generous friends and true Samaritans. Writing in French, probably for greater security, Longuet asks whether a prisoner found guilty of helping to forge currency is obliged to tell the judge the name of the main forger, even if this leads to many people being hanged and reputations being destroyed. Poynter replies, obviously in some alarm, that Longuet must be careful not to interfere in English justice. The letters between Longuet and Poynter become increasingly friendly and full of good news. In this one, Longuet gives an account of the number of baptisms and how his debt is reducing. He also sets out the programme of Sunday services, Mass at 11, Vespers at 3, and an exhortation extempore in the evening. In January 1813, Poynter sends as a New Year's gift a book of sermons. Longuet describes it as a true masterpiece of Christian eloquence, and writes of how his own sermons have brought in 14 new converts in the past 6 months. He states that his congregation now stands at 174. It was clearly thriving. In the same letter, Longuet writes about his visit to Yattenden, between Reading and Newbury, to visit Mr. Galini, who is unwell. As so often, he has made a unilateral decision, as he proposes to change the Sunday obligation to a Wednesday, so that Galini and his Catholic servants can attend Mass. However, the letter is annotated by Poynter. Sunday's obligation must remain. You may say Mass at Mr. Galini's house, providing all be decent. Longuet's visits to Yattenden would have been on horseback. He also regularly rode to see his friend Charles Lefebvre at Maple Durham. An important part of Longuet's work was instructing the children, and for this we know that he used Gobinet's Instruction of Youth in Christian Piety, which he held in both the original French and the English edition. From the mission registers, we know that there were occasionally aristocratic visitors to the mission. The most distinguished was Louis Philippe, who would eventually become King of France in 1830. The registers record his visit in the summer of 1816, along with the Duke and Duchess of Orléans, Prince and Princess Esterhazy, and the Prince of Liechtenstein, who, with their suites, attended Mass in this our Chapel of the Resurrection. But most of the names in the registers, initially mostly English, record a growing population of Italians, as well as French refugees, Irish immigrants, plus a few Germans and Dutch, and even Antoine Maillet, Français, habitant of Guadeloupe, who was marrying an English girl from Wantage. Longuet's ecumenical collaborations were not just in the prison. We know that he worked with the other Christian denominations to raise money for the Reading Dispensary, the forerunner of the Royal Berkshire Hospital, and he exchanged warm letters with a Protestant minister in Wallingford. Sadly, Longuet's work in Reading was brought to a tragic end in mid-February 1817, when he was attacked and murdered on the Oxford Road while riding back from teaching in Wallingford and Pangbourne. He was carrying his half-year's pay, and the attack was probably a mugging for the money. The Reading Mercury was full of the horrific details of the murder and of the police's attempts to find the perpetrator, with huge rewards being offered, as all the French priests were under the personal protection of George III and the Prince Regent, who would become George IV in 1820. Although various unlikely suspects are mentioned, including a man with a wooden leg and an itinerant chairmender, the culprit was never found. A strange story, probably fake news, appeared in papers all over the country, suggesting that 2 soldiers from the Blues Regiment of Horse Guards, then stationed in the barracks near the site of the murder, had confessed to the crime. It was swiftly followed by threats of legal action for libel, and an article denying it in the strongest terms appeared in the Windsor and Eton Express. But the story continued to be printed in papers as far away as Durham. Many tributes, even fulsome poetry, were published, and it's clear that Longuet was widely respected in the town and must have greatly enhanced the reputation of the Catholic Church, and indeed France. One tribute described him as a most worthy and respected gentleman of this town, and spoke of his loyalty, benevolence, goodness of heart, and the purity of those Christian values which influenced his conduct. It's clear that even the Cowslade family had come to respect and admire him. The most poignant account of the tragedy comes from Eleanor Cowslade, who was 25 at the time. This is a photograph of her in old age, taken in the 1880s. This is her account. Longuet had been ill, but when his illness took a favourable turn, he said to his venerable confrère, the Abbé Coudquin, "Since I am not to die of this illness, I foresee my fate. I shall die a violent death." As soon as his health was sufficiently restored, he resumed his occupation of teaching French and Latin to the sons of respectable people in the village of Pangbourne. In the evening of February the 13th, having received the half-yearly payment owing to him, he took his leave and mounted the pony, which was brought to the gate. The mistress of the house held a light, and, remarking the unusual darkness of the sky, urged him earnestly to dismount and pass the night under her roof, but, assuring her that he had not the slightest apprehension, he bade her farewell and rode off at a brisk trot. Early in the morning he was seen by the village postman lying in the middle of the road, in a pool of blood, lifeless and showing evidence of having been dead several hours. The news was carried to his residence by persons who had found his pony quietly grazing in a by-lane. After the inquest, which gave no clue towards discovering the perpetrators of the murder, but showed that a sharp instrument had been used by a gash across the forehead, which the cut hands had been thrown out to protect, the body was borne to the house in Vaston Lane, and placed in the sanctuary of the chapel, where the members of the congregation assembled to weep and pray. Eleanor movingly describes the funeral, when the congregation were able to breathe their requiem and shed their tears over the uncovered coffin before Longuet was buried under the chapel he had founded. Eleanor, writing years later in the 1840s, when she helped her Aunt Elizabeth to run a school in Caversham, believed that the murderer was a young man of good family who stole the money to pay his gambling debts, and she wrote that he later attempted suicide in the River Kennet, was rescued, but soon after died, to the relief of his family. We also have an account from a gentleman called William Silver Darter, a magistrate and mayor of Reading. In his Reminiscences of an Octogenarian, published in the 1880s, he remembers being at assembly in Reading School when the news of Longuet's death was brought by an old pupil, to the great distress of the few Catholic pupils. Bishop Poynter's diary records how he came to Reading and presided over the funeral. He also met the mayor, the chief magistrate, and other civic dignitaries, and after returning to London, informed the French ambassador. The Chapel of the Resurrection, where Longuet was initially buried, no longer exists, though its position may be recorded by the Rising Sun pub, now derelict. A letter in St James's archives suggests that when the Great Western Railway came to Reading in the 1830s, the chapel building was compulsorily purchased and demolished. Fortunately, it was possible by 1840 to transfer Longuet's remains to Pugin's new church of St James, where this brass plaque at the foot of the altar records his grave. Pugin himself strongly disapproved of such an austere inscription. In a letter to the parish priest, he wrote that it is just the sort of thing a Protestant would write. He sent a suggestion for a more suitable memorial, but his neo-Gothic image of a medieval priest could not be more different from the picture we have of Longuet. Unfortunately, the aftermath of Longuet's death was a dispute over his money and property. His family in France believed that they were entitled to claim all of it, including the chapel and house, so it was fortunate that Poynter had insisted that the deeds should be made out in his name. Charles Lefebvre wrote to Poynter to explain that he had been through Longuet's papers and had found an informal will, leaving certain amounts to his family. However, Lefebvre wrote, his friend had made it known that he assumed everything else would belong to the mission after his death. Lefebvre told Poynter that he had sorted through Longuet's correspondence to find any letters relating to the mission, which he proposed to send to the bishop in London, so that he could judge for himself whether they can be of some use to you, or whether some could compromise your interests, or those of our dear departed colleague, and presumably the ones in the archive are these ones that he sent. The bishop wrote sympathetically to François's brother in Normandy, describing the funeral and attempting to convince the family of Longuet's intention that his money and possessions were intended for the mission, but clearly without success. The whole question was handed over to a lawyer, William Talbot, almost certainly from the Shrewsbury family. As a result, we have a detailed and fascinating, though very difficult to read, inventory of all the furniture in the house. These are the articles in the back bowed bedroom, the front attic, and the front bedchamber. We also have a list of Longuet's books. Eventually, it was announced that, with the exception of the house, the chapel and its furnishings, all of Longuet's personal property, including £300 in government bonds, and all his library, were to revert to the family in France. No doubt the furniture and books were sold locally, and the proceeds sent from the sale to Normandy. Longuet would have been particularly sad, as we must be, at the loss of the important collection of books. This picture of the new St James's Church, where Longuet was reburied in 1840, including part of the abbey ruins, was drawn in the 1840s by Marianne Cowslade's 14-year-old granddaughter, Marianna Frederica, who was then living with her family in the newly built houses along Abbott's Walk, just to the south of the church. She would later marry into the Dent family of clockmakers, responsible for Big Ben. This modern picture of St. James's was painted by our son John, an architectural illustrator. In normal times, around 500 Catholics worship in the church every Sunday. François Longuet would no doubt be delighted at the way his pioneering work in Reading has flourished, and I think he would be particularly thrilled by the large numbers of women and girls who now serve at Mass or read the lessons on the altar beside his tomb. Longuet is virtually unknown today, even in Reading. He undoubtedly had his faults. He was quick to take offence and was seen as too innovative by some sections of the Catholic community. But he was an inspiring parish priest and a model of religious integration by a minority religion and nationality. Undoubtedly, he helped to allay suspicion towards Catholics and French immigrants in Reading. Finally, I'd like to read you a letter that he wrote to a Protestant clergyman in Wallingford, which was printed in the Mercury after his death. In it, he's obviously been explaining the sacrament of penance. This, I hope, my dear doctor, will satisfy you as to penance. You will take all this as coming from a Catholic man who is sincerely convinced of the truth of his religion, and bears no malice or antipathy to those who differ from him. Only I wish I could save all men, and above all your nation, whom I love more and more from day to day, for she is the only one who protects the pressed justice. Our king at last is forced to come and takes exile among you. This would be Louis XVIII. You have the most right to our gratitude. As to me, I look upon you as one good friend, and I am sincerely grateful to you and to your nation. I would very willingly sacrifice everything to you to save an English person of any description. I feel a great satisfaction when I can oblige any English person. I daily pray for the prosperity of the good and generous England. May she and her children be blessed to the end of the world. I hope to give you the second article next week, and when I've done all, I intend to set at work for the Dispensary. So don't expect I shall return you so soon the sermons, for perhaps I shall find something for me in them. Believe me, dear Doctor, with respect and gratitude, your most humble and obedient servant, F. Longuet. Longuet is a worthy patron of all the Catholic parishes in Reading, and he deserves to be better known. I do hope this brief introduction has been interesting. Thank you so much for inviting me.